The rain hammered against the windows of Romano's Italian restaurant as Sarah Martinez wiped down the last table of her evening shift. The clock on the wall showed 11:47 p.m., and the last customers had left nearly an hour ago. She should have been relieved to finally close up, but something felt different tonight. There was an electricity in the air that made her skin prickle with unease. Sarah had been working at Romano's for 3 years, ever since she moved to Portland from her small hometown in Oregon. At 24, she was saving money for nursing school while living in a cramped studio apartment above the old bakery on Maple Street. The restaurant job paid well enough, especially with tips from the wealthy clientele who frequented the upscale establishment. As she stacked chairs on tables, Sarah heard the front door chime echo through the empty dining room. She glanced at her watch and frowned. The door was supposed to be locked. Marco, the night manager, must have forgotten to flip the deadbolt before heading to his office to count the till. "I'm sorry, but we're closed," Sarah called out without looking up from her work. Silence. She straightened and turned toward the entrance, her breath catching in her throat. A man stood just inside the doorway, perfectly still in the dim lighting. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the light around it. His clothes were expensive, a black wool coat that looked handmade, dark slacks, and leather shoes that probably cost more than Sarah made in a month. But it was his eyes that made her step back involuntarily. They were an unusual shade of amber, almost golden, and they seemed to glow with an inner light that defied explanation. When he looked at her, Sarah felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "I apologize for the intrusion," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I was hoping I might still be able to get a table." Sarah found herself nodding before her rational mind could protest. "Of course. Right this way." She led him to a corner booth, the one with the best view of the city lights twinkling through the rain-streaked windows. As she set down a menu, she noticed his hands. They were pale, almost marble white, with long, elegant fingers. No wedding ring, but there was something old-fashioned about the way he carried himself, as if he belonged to a different era entirely. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Sarah asked, pulling out her order pad. The man studied the menu for a long moment, his amber eyes scanning the pages with unusual intensity. "What would you recommend?" "Well, we have an excellent wine selection. The 1947 Chateau d'Yquem is particularly special, though it is quite expensive." His lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Money is not a concern. However, I was thinking of something different. Perhaps something not on the menu." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his tone, something hungry and predatory that made every instinct scream at her to run. Instead, she found herself leaning closer. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and, for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. "I think you do know, Sarah Martinez." The fact that he knew her name should have terrified her, but, instead, she felt a strange calm washing over her. It was as if a fog had descended over her thoughts, muffling her fear and replacing it with an overwhelming desire to please this mysterious stranger. "Let me see what I can find in the back," she heard herself saying. As Sarah walked toward the kitchen, she felt as though she was moving through water. Her thoughts were sluggish, disconnected. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. The man's amber eyes seemed to follow her even when she couldn't see him. In the kitchen, she stood before the walk-in refrigerator, staring at the shelves without really seeing them. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching for a bottle of the restaurant's most expensive red wine. As her fingers closed around the neck of the bottle, a sharp pain shot through her head. Suddenly, the fog lifted. Sarah gasped, nearly dropping the wine as the full weight of what was happening crashed down on her. The man wasn't human. She didn't know how she knew it, but she was absolutely certain. Every cell in her body was screaming danger, and she realized with growing horror that he had somehow been controlling her mind. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, telling stories that Sarah had always assumed were just folklore from the old country. Tales of creatures that walked like men but thirsted for blood, beings with golden eyes that could bend human will to their desires. Vampires. The word formed in her mind with crystalline clarity, and Sarah's hands began to shake. She was alone in the restaurant with a vampire, and, somehow, he expected her to bring him blood to drink. But, whose blood? Sarah's eyes fell on the small cuts covering her hands from the evening's prep work, fresh wounds that had barely stopped bleeding. She looked at the wine bottle in her hands and understood with sick certainty what he intended. Moving quietly, Sarah grabbed a notepad from the kitchen counter and scribbled a hasty message with a shaking hand. She tore off the piece of paper and slipped it into her apron pocket, then took a deep breath to steady herself. When she returned to the dining room carrying the wine bottle and a glass, the man was sitting exactly as she had left him. His amber eyes tracked her movements with predatory focus, and she could see something inhuman lurking behind his handsome facade. "I found something special," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady as she set the glass on the table. As she began to pour the wine, her hand deliberately trembled, allowing her to lean closer to him. With practiced sleight of hand learned from years of serving demanding customers, she slipped the folded note onto the table next to his napkin. The vampire's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to her face. For a moment, Sarah was certain he could hear her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Time seemed frozen as he reached for the note with those pale, elegant fingers. Sarah held her breath as he unfolded the paper and read the words she had written: "Do not drink this, leave now." When he looked up at her again, something had changed in his expression. The predatory hunger was still there, but it was now mixed with something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Or surprise. "Interesting," he murmured, his voice like velvet over steel. Sarah realized she was still holding the wine bottle, and her hand was shaking so badly that the dark liquid was sloshing against the sides. She set it down carefully and took a step back, but the vampire's hand shot out faster than her eyes could follow. His fingers wrapped around her wrist with surprising gentleness, though she could feel the inhuman strength coiled beneath his touch. His skin was ice cold, confirming what she already knew about his nature. "Why?" he asked simply. Sarah looked into those golden eyes and saw something she hadn't expected. Beneath the supernatural predator was something almost lonely. Ancient and tired and achingly alone. "Because you're not the monster you're pretending to be," she whispered. The vampire stared at her for a long moment, his cold fingers still circling her wrist. Sarah could feel her pulse beating against his thumb, and she wondered if he could sense the blood flowing through her veins. "You have no idea what I am," he said softly. "I know you could have taken what you wanted without asking," Sarah replied. "I know you could have made me do anything, and I wouldn't have been able to stop you. But you didn't." Something flickered across his features, too quick for her to identify. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "My name is Adrian Blackwood," he said finally. "And you, Sarah Martinez, have just made a very dangerous choice." Sarah felt a shiver run through her, but not from fear. There was something about the way he said her name, something that made her feel as though she was the only person in the world who mattered. "What choice?" she asked. Adrian's thumb traced across the pulse point on her wrist, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You chose to see me as more than a monster. In my experience, that rarely ends well for humans." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the kitchen. Marco's voice called out, asking if she was almost finished closing up. The spell between them broke, and Adrian released her wrist. "I should go," he said, standing in one fluid motion. Sarah watched as he placed several $100 bills on the table, far more than necessary for a single glass of wine. As he moved toward the door, she found herself calling after him. "Will I see you again?" Adrian paused at the entrance, his hand on the door handle. When he turned back to look at her, his amber eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. "That depends," he said. "Are you certain you want to?" Without waiting for an answer, he disappeared into the night, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and 1,000 questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. As she finished cleaning up the restaurant, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the pale man with golden eyes. She told herself she should be terrified, should report the incident to the police or at least tell Marco what had happened. Instead, she found herself hoping that Adrian Blackwood would return. She had no way of knowing that her decision to warn him rather than serve him had set in motion events that would change both their lives forever. In the supernatural underworld of Portland, word was already spreading about the vampire king who had been denied his prey by a human girl with courage enough to look past the monster. And, in the shadows of the city, other creatures were taking notice. 3 days passed before Sarah saw Adrian Blackwood again, but she felt his presence long before he appeared. It started with small things: the sensation of being watched as she walked home from work, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, and the persistent feeling that she was no longer alone in the world. On Thursday evening, Sarah was restocking the wine cellar when she heard the familiar chime of the front door. Her heart immediately began racing, though she couldn't say if it was from fear or anticipation. She climbed the narrow stairs from the basement, brushing dust from her black uniform, and found Adrian sitting at the same corner booth as before. This time, however, he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, both pale and beautiful in the same ethereal way that marked them as something other than human. One had silver hair despite appearing to be in his 30s, with ice blue eyes that seemed to freeze everything they touched. The other was dark-haired like Adrian, but with sharp, angular features and a cruel smile that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Good evening, Sarah," Adrian said as she approached their table. His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the warning in his amber eyes. "Welcome back," Sarah replied, her waitress training kicking in despite her nervousness. "Can I get you gentlemen something to drink?" The silver-haired vampire laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I think we both know what we'd like to drink, don't we, Marcus?" The dark-haired one, Marcus, leaned back in his seat, studying Sarah with predatory interest. "Indeed, Vincent. Though I'm curious about this particular vintage. Tell me, girl, what makes your blood so special that it caught the attention of our king?" Sarah's step faltered. "King. They called Adrian their king." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Sarah said carefully. "Our wine list is quite extensive. Perhaps you'd like to see a menu?" Marcus's laugh was even more unsettling than Vincent's. "She's playing dumb, Adrian." "How quaint." Adrian's hand moved slightly on the table, and both vampires immediately fell silent. Sarah noticed the gesture and realized that whatever hierarchy existed among them, Adrian was definitely at the top. "We'll have a bottle of your finest red wine," Adrian said calmly. "And perhaps some of those delicious appetizers you serve." Sarah nodded and hurried to the kitchen, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of 3 sets of supernatural eyes following her every movement. As she selected a bottle of their most expensive Bordeaux, she tried to process what she had learned. Adrian wasn't just a vampire, he was their king. And, somehow, her refusal to serve him blood had attracted the attention of others of his kind. When she returned with the wine and a selection of appetizers, the 3 vampires were engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation conducted in whispers too low for human ears to catch. They fell silent as she approached. "Here we are," Sarah said, setting the bottle and glasses on the table. "Shall I open this for you?" "Please," Adrian said, but his eyes never left his companions. As Sarah worked to uncork the wine, she became aware that the conversation had resumed in a language she didn't recognize. It sounded ancient, with harsh consonants and flowing vowels that seemed to come from another era entirely. The tone, however, was unmistakably argumentative. Vincent suddenly switched to English, his ice blue eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "She's lovely, I'll give you that. But this unprecedented behavior is causing unrest among the council. They're questioning your judgment." "The council can question whatever they like," Adrian replied smoothly. "I've ruled for over 3 centuries without their interference. I don't intend to start seeking their approval now." Sarah's hands stilled on the wine bottle. 3 centuries. Adrian was over 300 years old. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "But you've never shown mercy to a blood servant before. You've never let prey escape. What makes this one different?" "That's enough," Adrian said, and there was something in his tone that made both vampires immediately back down. Sarah finished pouring the wine with trembling hands, acutely aware that she was being discussed like a piece of meat. When she set the bottle down, Adrian caught her wrist again, just as he had 3 nights before. "Walk with me," he said softly. It wasn't really a request. Sarah glanced nervously at Vincent and Marcus, both of whom were watching the interaction with intense interest.
I'm still working. I can't just leave.
Marco won't mind, Adrian said with quiet confidence.
Will you, Marco?
Sarah turned to see the night manager approaching their table, but there was something wrong with his expression. His eyes had the same glazed look that Sarah remembered from her own encounter with Adrian's mental influence. Of course not, Marco said in a monotone voice.
Sarah, why don't you take your break now? Take all the time you need.
Sarah stared at her boss in horror. Marco, are you? He's fine, Adrian assured her, standing and still holding her wrist.
He'll remember nothing of this conversation. But, I do need to speak with you privately. Sarah found herself nodding, though every instinct told her to run.
As Adrian led her toward the restaurant's back entrance, she heard Vincent call after them.
Don't take too long, Your Majesty. We have business to discuss.
The cool night air hit Sarah's face like a slap as they stepped into the alley behind Romano's. Adrian released her wrist and moved a few steps away, his hands clasped behind his back. In the dim light from the street lamps, he looked like a figure from another century. You're in danger, he said without preamble. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly, cold.
From your friends in there?
Vincent and Marcus are not my friends. They're members of my court, and they serve me only because they fear the consequences of disobedience. But they've never understood mercy, and your continued existence puzzles them.
My continued existence?
Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather.
Are you saying they want to kill me?
Adrian turned to face her, his amber eyes reflecting the streetlight like a cat's. I'm saying that in our world, humans who learn our secrets rarely survive to tell them. The fact that I've allowed you to live has caused speculation.
What kind of speculation? Some believe you've bewitched me somehow. Others think you possess some unique quality that makes you valuable as a blood source.
A few even suspect that I'm growing weak, becoming too human. His laugh was bitter.
If they only knew the truth. Sarah took a step closer to him. What is the truth?
For a moment, Adrian's carefully controlled facade cracked, and Sarah saw something raw and vulnerable in his expression. The truth is that I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone show me kindness without expecting anything in return.
When you warned me instead of serving me your blood, you reminded me of something I thought I'd lost forever. What? My humanity.
The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah felt her heart racing, but this time it wasn't from fear. Adrian, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. You need to understand what you're getting involved in, he said.
I am not human, Sarah. I am a predator.
I have killed more people than you could count, and I will kill again. The blood of innocence stains my hands, and no amount of remorse can wash it clean. Sarah studied his face in the dim light.
If that's true, then why didn't you kill me? You had the perfect opportunity.
Because for the first time in 3 centuries, someone looked at me and saw more than a monster.
Because you were brave enough to try to save me, even knowing what I was. Because.
He trailed off, running a hand through his dark hair. Because I found myself caring more about your safety than my own hunger. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that spread through her entire body.
So what happens now? Now you have a choice to make, Adrian said. You can walk away. Forget this ever happened.
I'll ensure that Vincent and Marcus lose interest in you, and you can go back to your normal life. Or. Adrian's eyes met hers, and Sarah saw centuries of loneliness and pain reflected in their golden depths. Or you can trust me to protect you, knowing that doing so will change your life forever. That you'll become part of a world that operates by rules you can't imagine, where death lurks around every corner and the price of my protection might be higher than you're willing to pay. Sarah felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to make a leap that would either destroy her or set her free. The smart choice was obvious: walk away, go back to her normal life, pretend this had all been a strange dream. But, as she looked at Adrian, saw the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, Sarah realized that walking away wasn't really an option.
Not anymore. I choose you, she said softly.
Adrian's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected her answer.
You don't understand what you're saying.
Yes, I do. Sarah stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the unnatural coldness that radiated from his skin. I'm saying that I'd rather face the unknown with you than live a safe, boring life without you. For a long moment, they stood there in the alley, vampire and human, predator and prey, staring at each other in the dim light. Then, Adrian reached out and cupped her face in his pale hands. I swear to you, he said, his voice fierce with conviction, that as long as I exist, no harm will come to you. Not from my kind, not from any other creature of the night, not from any enemy I possess. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. And, I swear to you that I'll never run, never betray you, never stop believing that there's good in you, no matter what anyone else says. Adrian's thumb traced across her cheek, catching a tear she didn't realize had fallen. Then, God help us both, he whispered, because I fear we're both doomed. But, as he leaned down to press his forehead against hers, Sarah thought that perhaps some kinds of doom were worth embracing. 2 weeks after Sarah chose to trust Adrian, her world had become something entirely different from the simple life she had once known. She still worked at Romano's, but now she understood that the restaurant served a purpose beyond feeding hungry customers. It was neutral ground in the supernatural community, a place where vampires, witches, shapeshifters, and other creatures could meet without the constant threat of violence. Adrian had introduced her to this hidden world gradually, always watching for signs that the knowledge was too much for her to bear. But Sarah surprised them both with how quickly she adapted. Perhaps it was her grandmother's stories that had prepared her, or perhaps some people were simply meant to walk between worlds. She learned that Portland's supernatural community was vast and complex, with Adrian ruling over the vampires while maintaining delicate treaties with other supernatural factions. She discovered that vampires could survive on animal blood or donated human blood, though most preferred to hunt. Adrian, she learned, had been subsisting on the former for decades, trying to minimize the harm his existence caused. Most importantly, she learned that loving a vampire came with a price that went far beyond the obvious dangers. You've been distracted lately, Elena Vasquez, the restaurant's head server, commented as they set up for the dinner service. Elena was a witch who had worked at Romano's for 5 years, and she had become something of a mentor to Sarah in navigating the supernatural world. I'm fine, Sarah replied, though her hands were shaking as she folded napkins.
Elena's dark eyes missed nothing. It's him, isn't it? The Vampire King. You're falling in love with him. Sarah's hands stilled.
She hadn't said the words out loud yet, not even to herself, but hearing them from someone else made them impossible to deny.
Is it that obvious? Sarah asked. To anyone with eyes, Elena said gently. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Sarah could answer, the familiar chime of the front door announced the arrival of customers. But, when Sarah looked up, her blood turned to ice. Vincent and Marcus had returned, and this time they had brought others with them. 5 vampires in total stood in the entrance, all of them radiating the kind of cold menace that made the air itself seem thinner. The few human customers in the restaurant suddenly looked uncomfortable, though they probably couldn't say why. Sarah, Vincent called out, his voice carrying clearly across the dining room. How delightful to see you again. Is our dear king available? Sarah felt Elena's hand on her arm, offering silent support. I'm sorry, but Mr. Blackwood isn't here this evening. It was the truth. Adrian had gone to San Francisco to deal with some crisis involving the vampire covens there. He was supposed to return tonight, but Sarah didn't know exactly when. Marcus smiled his cruel smile. How unfortunate. You see, we have some business to discuss with him. About you. The temperature in the restaurant seemed to drop several degrees. Other customers began to leave, apparently deciding they had somewhere else to be. Soon, the dining room was empty except for Sarah, Elena, and the 5 vampires. Perhaps we could wait for him together, Vincent suggested, his ice blue eyes gleaming with malicious intent. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if we got to know his little pet better. She's under his protection, Elena said firmly, stepping slightly in front of Sarah. By vampire law, harming her would be an act of war against your king. Vampire law, Marcus laughed. How quaint that you think human concerns take precedence over vampire justice. Sarah's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stand straight. She had learned enough about vampire politics to know that showing weakness would only make things worse. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Vincent tilted his head, studying her like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "We want to understand what makes you so special. What power you hold over our king that has made him forget his nature." "I don't have any power over him." "Don't you?" Marcus stepped closer, his movements predatory. "In 3 centuries, Adrian Blackwood has never shown mercy to a human. Never let prey escape. Never allowed anyone to refuse him anything. Yet here you are, alive and unharmed, having done all 3. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. "You think I'm manipulating him somehow?" "We think," said a new voice from behind the vampires, "that you represent a threat to the natural order." Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the speaker. Thomas Ashford was Adrian's lieutenant, a vampire who had served under him for over a century. If Thomas was here, it meant this wasn't just the actions of a few discontented court members. This was something more official. "Thomas," Elena said carefully. "I thought you were loyal to Adrian." "I am loyal," Thomas replied. "Which is why I can't stand by and watch him destroy himself over a human girl." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. "I would never hurt him." "You already have," Thomas said sadly. "The other vampire lords are questioning his strength. Some are openly discussing rebellion. There are rumors that he's gone soft, that he's no longer fit to rule. All because of his obsession with keeping you alive." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. In trying to protect her, Adrian was undermining his own position, possibly putting himself in danger. She had known there would be consequences to their relationship, but she hadn't understood how far-reaching they might be. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked quietly. "Leave," Vincent said immediately. "Disappear. Make it clear to everyone that the king has grown tired of his human plaything and discarded you as he should have done from the beginning." "And if I don't?" Marcus's smile turned feral. "Then, we'll be forced to take more direct action. For the good of all vampire kind, you understand." Sarah understood perfectly. They were threatening to kill her if she didn't voluntarily remove herself from Adrian's life. The irony wasn't lost on her. They claimed to be protecting him by taking away the one thing that made him happy. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "You have until tomorrow night," Thomas said. "After that, we can no longer guarantee your safety." The vampires filed out of the restaurant as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving Sarah alone with Elena and the weight of an impossible decision. "You're not seriously considering leaving him," Elena said. Sarah sank into a chair, her legs no longer willing to support her. "Maybe I should. If my being here is really putting him in danger." "Sarah, listen to me." Elena knelt beside her chair, her dark eyes intense. "I've known Adrian Blackwood for 5 years. In all that time, I've never seen him truly happy. Not until he met you. Whatever those vampires think they're protecting, it's not the man you fell in love with. It's just a shell, a role he's been playing for so long that he forgot who he really was underneath. But if other vampires are planning to rebel against him, then he'll deal with them, just like he has for 3 centuries. But he'll do it better with you by his side than he ever could alone." Before Sarah could respond, she felt a familiar chill in the air. The front door opened, and Adrian stepped inside, his amber eyes immediately finding her across the room. One look at her face was enough to tell him that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, crossing the room in a few swift strides. Sarah looked up at him, this man who had lived for over 300 years, who commanded the respect and fear of creatures she was still learning existed. She thought about Vincent's threat, about the rebellion brewing among his own kind, about the impossible position she had put him in simply by existing. And then, she thought about the loneliness she had seen in his eyes that first night, the way he had held her face in his hands and promised to protect her, the gentle way he touched her as if she were something precious and fragile. "Thomas was here," Sarah said. "Along with Vincent and Marcus. They want me to leave you, to make it look like you discarded me." They say other vampire lords are questioning your leadership because of me. Adrian's expression darkened, his amber eyes flashing with anger. Did they threaten you? They said they couldn't guarantee my safety if I didn't disappear by tomorrow night.
For a moment, Adrian was perfectly still, and Sarah could almost see the predator beneath his human facade. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet.
They dared to threaten what is mine. Adrian, maybe they have a point, Sarah said quickly. Maybe I should know. The word cracked through the air like a whip.
Adrian knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his cold ones.
Sarah, look at me.
She met his eyes, seeing centuries of pain and loneliness and determination reflected there. I have spent 300 years being exactly what they expected me to be, Adrian said.
A killer. A monster.
A king who ruled through fear and brutality.
Do you know what that kind of existence does to a person?
It hollows you out from the inside until there's nothing left but hunger and anger and an endless, aching emptiness. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes.
Adrian.
You gave me back my soul, he continued, his voice fierce with emotion. You looked at me and saw not the monster I had become, but the man I used to be. For the first time in 3 centuries, I remember what it feels like to hope, to care about something other than mere survival.
You think I would give that up to appease a handful of discontented vampires?
But, if it means civil war among your kind, then let there be war, Adrian said simply. I have ruled for 3 centuries, and I will rule for 3 centuries more if necessary. But, I will not go back to being the empty shell I was before I met you.
Not for them, not for anyone.
Sarah stared at him, seeing the absolute conviction in his eyes.
You're sure about this?
Adrian smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face.
Sarah Martinez, I have never been more certain of anything in my very long life. The question is, are you willing to stand with me? Because I won't lie to you, the road ahead won't be easy.
There will be challenges, dangers, possibly war. But, we'll face them together. Sarah thought about the life she had known before Adrian, simple and safe and utterly ordinary. Then, she thought about the life he was offering her, dangerous and uncertain but filled with a love that had already changed them both.
The choice was surprisingly easy.
I told you before, Sarah said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands.
I choose you.
Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch. I love you, he said quietly. I know I shouldn't, I know it complicates everything, but I do.
I love you more than I have ever loved anything in 3 centuries of existence.
I love you too, Sarah whispered back. As Adrian kissed her there in the empty restaurant, Sarah felt the last of her doubts melt away. She had chosen her path, and she would walk it with the vampire king who had found his humanity through her love. Whatever came next, they would face it together. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Portland sky, and Sarah couldn't help but think it sounded like the approaching drums of war. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had Adrian, and he had her, and somehow that felt like enough to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The server had given the vampire king more than just a warning that first night. She had given him hope, love, and the courage to fight for something worth protecting. And, in return, he had given her a love that would span centuries and a place in a world she never could have imagined. As they held each other in the quiet restaurant, Sarah realized that some love stories didn't end with happily ever after. Instead, they began with it, and everything that followed was just another chapter in an epic that would be told for generations to come. The vampire king had found his queen, and she had found her home in his ancient heart. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them as partners, equals, and soulmates who had chosen each other against all odds and all reason. And, sometimes, Sarah thought as Adrian's arms tightened around her, that kind of choice was the most powerful magic of all.